So I want to welcome everybody here. My name is Debbie Nicole. I am the chairperson of the workshop committee for the Kent County Master Gardeners. Our presenter today is Anita Smith. Anita has been a master gardener in Virginia starting in 2006. She transferred to Delaware in 2013. And since she's been here, she has done many workshops for us, especially back in person where we did a lot of hands-on container gardening and arranging things. Not my specialty, but it's definitely her specialty. So she's here today to help you guys figure out how to do your own container gardens. So thanks everybody for coming. And Anita, I will turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you. I want to welcome everyone. My name is Anita, and I will be the Container Gardener Gardening Workshop presenter. Cooperative Extension in Delaware is managed by two sister universities, the University of Delaware in Newark and Delaware State University in Dover. Cooperative Extension exists in all 50 states and is the way that the states are carrying out the mandate from the federal government for the land grant colleges set up in the 1860s to distribute information-based research to the public. Extension is your tax dollars at work, so I encourage you to definitely use it. As I said, this is your container gardening workshop. Whether you've downsized and moved from a large piece of property to something smaller, or you're aging and need to make your gardening more accessible, you have certain plants that have particular growing requirements, or you just want to place a plant in a spot that lacks suitable growing conditions, such as soil, container gardening is definitely your answer. Where can you container garden? The areas, the spaces are unlimited. A patio, a porch, a deck, a balcony, a garden, an existing in-the-ground garden, a windowsill inside your house, and a corner inside your house that doesn't get much light. Here's an example of a porch or patio container garden. There's obviously no soil there that plants could grow in on this brick patio, but you place a few containers and you've got everything that the plants need to grow. You can place a container garden on a deck with a railing. Again, this is obviously not a place where a plant would grow, but you get a beautiful container garden that actually visually enhances the railing on the deck. This is a container garden in an existing in-the-ground garden, and it gives a whole nother dimension, a level of height that you wouldn't normally have. You've got sedum growing in a strawberry pot, and it really adds a lot of interest. Now, I admit this is an ideal windowsill, and I wish that I had something like this in my home. But I do have a small windowsill in the kitchen, and a lot of people can grow herbs in a window and have them very close and convenient for when they're cooking. What could be better than that? If you have a dark corner inside your house where previously you've had a fake plant, you could grow a real plant and really get a pop of color, of a good vibe, a plant vibe, underneath a fluorescent light. You can do it individually, as this illustration shows, or you could actually put in shelves with fluorescent lights on them that would allow you to have a whole indoor garden on shelving. Your first decision when you're making a container garden is what kind of a pot you're going to use. And I have a lot of them listed. I have used just about all of these choices. Some of them are good for some things and some of them are good for others. So I have used my choices of different containers for different growing requirements of the pots that I'm going to put them in. So we're going to go through each one of these categories and go over the pros and cons of each category. Plastic is the first choice that I've listed. And I want to say right away that the best plastic is a double-walled plastic container. The plastic is on either side of an air pocket, and the air pocket does a great deal to help regulate the temperature of that pot. The pros for plastic pots are that they definitely hold moisture. There's no moisture passing through the plastic barrier. So once you water a container, it's in that container. They're lightweight, you can move them around a lot. And I have learned the hard way. You think you've placed a pot and boy, as soon as it starts growing or you're rearranging things, you want the pot in a different place. The plastic pots are easy to move. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, and some really gorgeous, vibrant colors. And if you tend to spend a little more, or you do spend a little more for a plastic pot, you'll get one that's pretty long lasting. Some of them are definitely thicker than others, and they last longer. The cons for the plastic pots are that they do not insulate against extreme temperatures. And a lot of my pots I leave out all winter long. So I don't have very many plastic pots outside. I have some on my porch and I bring them in the winter. Frequently, they need added weight for balance. If you put a tall plant in a plastic pot, where I'm located, I have unbelievable wind, and I've had a 6-foot plant blow over in a pot because the wind is just ferocious for sometimes what seems like no reason at all. No rain, no thunder, no nothing, just wind. And the plastic pots do not breathe. So it's a plus in that it holds the moisture, but it is a negative in the fact that it doesn't breathe and the roots might need the breathing, or they do need the breathing. All right, this is a Goji Berry in a double-walled plastic pot, and this is the one that I was talking about that blew over. It's in the plastic pot for a very specific reason that I'll get to later in the presentation. The next example of the kind of pot that you might choose is clay and terracotta. I put the two of them in the same category because they have very similar pros and cons. You can get either one glazed, and you need to know right away that the glazing cuts down on the breathing ability of clay especially. It still breathes some, but not as much as it would if it didn't have that plastic or, ceramic coating on it. So the pros of clay and terracotta are that they breathe. They're good for wet spots because they're so porous. So once they get wet, they dry out quickly. Plastic is not heavy. Clay and terracotta definitely is. And the bigger your pot is, the heavier it is. It's less likely to tumble around in the wind, but it's also not moved around easily. You can see that under the con column. You're going to need hand trucks or sturdy bodies, strong bodies to help you move a big terracotta pot. The terracotta and the clay insulate against the heat and the cold, so that is a good point. And I do leave a lot of my terracotta and clay outside all winter long. Here is an example of a terracotta, a clay pot. It does have a glaze on it. It was just kind of a whimsical arrangement that I saw. The glaze did keep the water from passing through the clay, but given the location of the plant, where it's hanging up on a post, it was exposed to air currents a lot. So it did hold water in a situation that I thought was going to be better for the plant, which obviously was, because if you look at the face on this terracotta pot, it looks like it's the sedum is the hair growing out of the top of the head. And there is, if you can see it, under the chin of the face, there's a small drain hole that comes down. It looks like a little pedestal. So it did drain somewhat through that small hole. And this was just a lot of fun to have around. The next material that you can find in containers is wood. And there are pros and cons, of course. Wood blends very well with a variety of plant materials because it is such a natural looking, it is natural itself. So it looks good with a lot of plant material. It's easy to make an arrangement look good. If it's treated with preservative so that it won't rot, it can last a long time. And wood is a good insulation against heat and cold. It'll keep the soil in the pot at a more consistent, moderate temperature. The cons of using wood is that if it's treated, especially when you're going to be putting herbs, vegetables in it, you're going to need a plastic liner to keep that treatment that's been done to the wood from getting into the roots of the vegetables. They're not going to be very beneficial to something that you're going to eat. I do know now, it's just been in the last year or so, that the treatment that they're using for wood to preserve it is not as toxic. There's not as much arsenic in it. So that is definitely getting to be a better situation. The wood containers, depending on their size, if you use a whiskey barrel or half a whiskey barrel, again, you're talking about a heavy container, and it's not going to be easy to move around unless you've got help or a hand truck. Here's an example of a wooden container. Master gardeners call this a salad table. It's actually a raised bed. I'm assuming that this one is not treated with any kind of preservative, but you can see that you can plant edible flowers, nasturtium and pansies can be planted in with your herbs, and any salad material, your lettuces and things that you're going to put in your salads. And this, again, this whole arrangement all together with flowers and herbs and lettuce makes a very pleasing sight on the edge of your patio. There is fiberglass container material used for container. And there, as you can see, there's lots of pros. They are lightweight. They're very strong and durable. They'll last season after season. They can be left out in the weather. They're strong and they're molded and finished to look like natural materials. Some of them are just gorgeous. They're long lasting. They insulate against heat and cold. So again, you're going to get your roots being protected from extremes of one sort or the other. The con is that they are expensive. And I have one fiberglass pot. You'll see in my illustration, this is not mine. Mine is not this big. I mean, this pot looks just gorgeous. It's finished to look like concrete or carved stone. And there's either a holly or boxwood in it, and it's large, which is great for a small shrub, but you can see by the price that if you can afford one, that's probably going to be the limit for most people. You're not going to have a row of these across the back of your patio. The last category that I'm going to talk about is a metal container. And there are the pros and cons are, if it's lightweight, and that would be something like an old wash tub that you've drilled holes in, you definitely need drainage. That's a relatively light metal container, and it holds the moisture. If you've got this metal container placed out on a stump or something in the yard, and it's going to get a lot of sunshine, you're not going to have the evaporation through the sides of the metal that you do in a terracotta or a terracotta or a clay pot. The cons is that they can be heavy, especially if you're using something like cast iron, a big old cauldron or an urn that you see. The Victorian urns were always done in cast iron. It does not breathe at all, and it's going to heat up. If you have a lightweight, especially a thin wash tub, which I did have once on a stump, it'll get so hot in the sun that you can't touch it with your hand. So you have to be careful of maybe where you're going to place it or the kind of plants you're going to put in it. It does not insulate. If the metal gets cold, the soil and the roots are going to get cold, and the metal is a good conductor of heat and cold. And it may eventually rust, especially on the bottom where the water is draining through the container. This is an example of an old cast iron urn that I really was attracted to because of the location. It was in an alley down between two older buildings, older houses, and it was placed in front of a metal gate. So you were looking through the metal to a beautiful arrangement in a metal urn. The first or the second after you choose your container is soil. And the reason I said first is because soil is the most important part of container gardening. A plant in a container must be provided with the best possible soil conditions within the confines of that container. The roots can't go anyplace else outside that container for something they might need. Garden soil is too heavy to fill your containers with. It will compact and be a real problem for the roots. I actually use so much potting soil that I mix my own potting soil. And a good rule of thumb, if you're going to mix your own, I have a big garbage can that I put these three ingredients into. A large bag of garden soil, a small bale, because you can get the peat moss in bales. A small one is plenty because as it pulls in moisture, it expands. And then a good sized bag of perlite or vermiculite. And just so that you know, the perlite, if you have looked at a good bag of container gardening soil, the perlite is the crunchy looking little stones or rocks that are white, and they really show up. And if you take one in your fingers and it's crunchy. Vermiculite acts the same way that the perlite does, but vermiculite has a completely different look. It's flakes of a glass-like mineral that they're mixed in with the soil and then do the same thing that the perlite does. They keep the soil from compacting. So you can take these three ingredients and put them in a big garbage can and take a shovel, a hand shovel, or my mixture is so large, I end up using a long handled shovel, and I mix it all up, and then I scoop it out after it's well mixed. I also put in soil additives for fertilization and water retention. And these are the two materials that I'm talking about. The first one that looks like a pile of sugar or salt, and there are crystals that are a little larger than sugar or salt. You can buy these moisture crystals in a bag, and the instructions are on the bag as to how much you can use per pot, or depending on the size of your pot, how much you can use. So these two materials, the second one being the time-released fertilizer, I add to my soil by the potful, so that I'm putting in a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons, depending on how big the pot is. The time-released fertilizer looks like little BBs, and I've noticed mine have been gold for years, and now I've noticed in the pre-mixed bags of potting soil that they are being manufactured as green now. And these time-released fertilizers do exactly what I'm saying. They are releasing the fertilizer slowly over time. They are heat activated, and if you see them when they have popped open like little kernels of popcorn, then you know that they're releasing the fertilizer. So in the summertime, when they're really in the soil that's warming up, they will pop up like little kernels of popcorn. These two things are added after I have put the soil in a container. The next consideration for container gardening is watering. And this illustration, fortunately or unfortunately, shows you exactly what not to do. Watering the foliage directly in a container garden promotes fungus and other diseases, and it wastes water. You want to water slowly at the base of the plant. So you take this nozzle head and you gently push it down in, take your hand maybe and pull the foliage apart, gently lower it down into the pot, and have this water running right down on the soil at the top of the container, right where the roots are. Right underneath the soil, the roots are, and that's what needs the water. My grandfather taught me how to water, and it was a long time before he trusted me to do it myself. And I'm doing the same thing with my own granddaughter. She's been helping me since she was about 4, and just now that she's 11, I'm letting her water. You can mix water-soluble fertilizer into your watering can once a week. And we are not allowed to use name brands when we're talking in our presentations, but this is the blue water that everybody uses to fertilize their plants. Once a week, possibly 2 if you have some real hungry plants in your containers, but once a week should be enough. You may also notice with your container gardens that as they get warmer and dry out, there's a gap between the side wall of the container and the potting soil. And when you're watering, you have to be very careful and patient to water slowly enough that the soil will absorb that water that you're putting on it. Otherwise, the water is running down between the gap and right out the hole at the bottom of the container. And speaking of holes, that is another thing that is extremely important. A lot of times when you buy the plastic containers, there's an indentation where the hole should be, but it hasn't been drilled or knocked out yet. You need to make sure that you have drainage holes in your container. So your objective is to get the soil wet, not to just have it run down the sides of the outside of the pot or have it on the foliage. You need to get it into the soil. Another thing you can use, as I showed you in the last slide, is the moisture crystals. And you mix these salt or sugar-looking crystals into your pot. That's an additive that you add pot by pot. And you need to mix them well, because I made the mistake. The first time I used them, I did not mix them well. I left a lot of them up on the top surface of the soil. Well, the first time it rained, these moisture crystals swell up. They absorb the water and swell up. And in the soil and on top of the soil, they look like little cubes of clear jello. So I had this gelatinous mass on top of the container with all the water pulled out of the soil up into the soil crystals. And it was a mess to get rid of and to essentially start all over again to make sure that I had them mixed into the soil the way they should be. Containers have to be watered once a day during the heat of the summer and sometimes twice. When it gets really hot, and we had 4 or 5 weeks of just unbearable dry heat here in Delaware in May, and the containers had to be watered every day, sometimes twice a day. The way you tell if your container is really needing water besides wilted plants, you can stick your index finger down into the soil, past the first or second knuckle, between the first and second knuckle, and you can feel the moisture. If it feels dry down at the tip of your finger, then your pot is needing moisture. So that's a good moisture test, to just stick this index finger down in. Plant materials are the next consideration. And you can mix flowers, vegetables, herbs in any combination you want. You can have just a small pot outside your kitchen door, and it can be filled with herbs and things that you can run out to pick when you want to cook. You can put vegetables in pots, and we'll talk about the vegetables in a little bit. You can put small ornamental shrubs and trees, but this gets tricky. And you need to watch your selections in your pots so that everything in the same pot has the same water requirements, sun and shade, fertilizer, etc. You want like demanding plants in the container together. One plant that I said when I'm talking about special needs, I showed you that I had my Goji Berry plant in a container by itself, because it thrives in unusually high alkaline soil, up over a 7, 8, sometimes 9. So I am adding a cup of lime to that container every spring when the plant comes out of dormancy, because I want to make sure that it's able to use the soil that it's in. And if I had that Goji Berry in a garden and I was dumping that much lime on it, that would affect other plantings nearby. So the way I have it isolated in its container, it's as happy as can be, and I get about a pint of Goji berries off that plant every season. It's been in the same container for 6 years, and it's just doing well. The vegetables that you want to put in containers, you need, for a large vegetable vegetable like tomatoes, eggplants, a pepper plant, squash, and I'm not even thinking about the kind of squash that runs, but a patio, a small dwarfed kind of squash. They still get huge. The leaves get big. You're going to be lucky if you can put one vegetable plant in a pot. And I'm not talking about a little pot, a big pot, 24 inches in diameter. So again, you can maybe get 4 or 5 relatively expensive pots. You can put your vegetables in them if you're doing it carefully. I have herbs in pots, but I put just one herb in a pot because I do leave them to overwinter, and each year they're getting a little bigger and a little bigger. And I said I had the goji berry in there. There's nothing in the pot with the goji berry. You all know tomatoes and peppers and things like that, besides the plant, you most often have to put in some kind of support, a trellis or a cage, and all that takes up room. So you're planting with a vegetable, you're planting other things in with it, like I said, support systems and things like that. You just need to be sure, I mentioned this before, that the plants that you put in a single container all have the same requirements. And the best way to do this is by reading the labels that you find in the little containers. We'll go into that a little more. You can have fun when you're planting your containers. Your artistic talents can come out. And there used to be, I'm not sure if people are still familiar with it, a little ditty or whatever that gives you an idea about how you might want to arrange your plants. Thriller, filler, spiller. And in this small arrangement in the corner of a deck, I used just 3 plants, and I used a tall Dracaena. That was my thriller. Your thriller is an eye catcher. It draws your eye to the arrangement. The filler was Impatience, which was the burst of color and a really pretty contrasting green leaf. And then the spiller is Lysmachia, or some people know it as Creeping Jenny, hanging over the side of the pot. This is an old arrangement, and I want to caution you, the Impatience for the last 3 years or so have pretty much disappeared from the market. They were a good shade plant, but they developed a virus and growers actually took them off the market. I understand now that they've developed some varieties that are resistant to this virus that was so prevalent and just went rampant through them and destroyed them every summer. The Lysmachia, I used to like using this. It was kind of a fun spillover material, but it has been put on the invasive list in Delaware. So you need to keep up with your plant materials as best you can. You can go online, and if you want information that is research-based, you can follow your search request online with the word extension, and then you will get, in the mid-Atlantic area, you get the University of Maryland, the University of Delaware, Penn State University, Virginia Tech in Virginia. You get research-based information, and you will get information about whether a plant is invasive in your area, what's happening with it in the nursery market. You'll get some good information, and doing your searches with the word extension is very valuable. As many annuals and most vegetables need only 12 to 14 inches of soil, unless you have something that has a taproot on it. It's foolish to be filling your pots with 24 inches, or some of them that I have are tall, nearly 36 inches. You don't want to put 36 inches of soil in a pot where you're going to put something that only needs 14 inches of depth for the roots. When my pots are deeper than they need to be, I fill them 1/3 to 1/2 with a filler. And these are the fillers that I've used. They're very easy to find, and they're relatively inexpensive. I used crushed aluminum cans, and they're terrific because they don't rust. And they'll be in the bottom of the pots for years. I've planted pots, and then 5 years later, I'm cleaning them out because I'm going to completely refresh the soil and do everything all over again. And the aluminum cans are still faithfully sitting down at the bottom. These, again, are somewhat of an obsolete option. The packing peanuts that used to come when you ordered a package online or something, these peanuts were all around whatever it was that you purchased, and you ended up throwing them out in a cardboard box. And my neighborhood used to be filled up with these blowing around in the wind because people had put them out in the garbage cans and they got loose and they're blowing all around the neighborhood. But they make fantastic filler for the bottoms of pots. And then over here, we have some gravel, or you can use pebbles. And these two on the left of the slide are lightweight. So if your container is big and heavy and you don't want to add any more weight, then you use one of these two lightweight fillers at the bottom. And if you have a smaller pot that you don't want to blow over because it has a taller plant in it or something, you use the gravel or the pebbles to add weight. So once you've decided about one of these fillers and the plants that you want to put into your container, we're going to talk about planting your container. And again, plant labels, plant plants with like needs together. And please, 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 master gardeners are always saying the same thing. Read the plant labels. That's where you're going to find out how much sun they need, what their temperature tolerance is, and if you find out if they're perennial or an annual. In some places, things can be perennial. In other places, they're not because the temperature drops are too great for them. Read the plant labels, and this is some just advice. The labels are a good source of information, and sometimes they're more reliable than inexperienced garden center help. You can ask a person at a garden center who's taken a temporary job if a plant is tolerant of how much light it's tolerant of. And they might say, oh, you can put it out in direct sun. Well, you can't if you read the label. It might say parts sun, and parts sun is 4 to 6 hours. Full sun is 10 hours. If you put a plant that cannot tolerate 10 hours of direct sun in the sunlight, it's not going to grow to its capacity. So read your plant labels. They are like Bibles, and you'll end up getting the plants with similar needs in the pot together. If you're going to use seedlings or cuttings in your pots, and I do, we'll go further into this in another slide, do not crowd the plants. You can put as few as 3 cuttings or seedlings in a large diameter pot, 24 inches, and depending on the plant's growth patterns, by the end of that summer, or at the end of the summer, that plant will be, pot will be planted, and the plants will be fully developed and filling everything in, and they will look great. Give them room to grow. If you're using mature plants, you can pack them in more tightly. If they're in flower, that's an indication that they're mature because they're all already 2/3 of the way through their growth cycle. And you can pack them in more tightly. They're not going to grow much longer, or they're not going to get any bigger. They're finished growing, so to speak. So in the category where you're doing seedlings or cuttings, I will show you a container garden that I have across my back porch where I put 2 cuttings and 1 seedling in big containers. Like I said, some of them are 18, 24 inches in diameter. And you'll see what happens in between mid-May when they get planted and July. If you're using the mature plants, be sure you tease out the roots. And here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is a New Guinea impatiens that I purchased, and you can look down at the roots when I pulled out the container, and you can pull out a plant from its container at the garden center if you'd like, because you can get or end up with plants that are so pot bound. The root tangling and circling is not just at the bottom of the container, it's all throughout. And then you have a really big mess to take care of. This is what you end up having to do. You tease the roots out. And I actually pulled off this tangled mess at the bottom because I left a lot of hair roots at the top, and I knew that this plant was going to actually transplant and adapt quicker once you do that. There is a hormone that is produced when the roots start hitting the side of the container that instructs the roots to start circling, and that does not stop activation until you tease out all that congestion and tangling. You've got to get rid of that before the hormone that's telling it to circle is no longer being activated. You want the roots to go out into the soil in the top of you or in your new big container. This is the container garden that I was talking about across my back porch. There are 3 plants in these containers. The coleus is my thriller. The euphorbia is my filler. And the secretia is my spiller. Just 3 plants. The coleus and the secretia are cuttings that I put in. I put in 1 little stalk of plants that I've kept alive in the house. I keep 1 plant each of the coleus and 1 of the secretia. And I make all the cuttings for all these pots from those 2 plants. The euphorbia is a baby's breath like flower. So it gives a really full, you can see it. Well, in this case, some of it's hidden. It's in the back. The 3 colors just seem to go to, or the 3 plants with their colors just seem to go together. The lime green with the red, and then the purple leaves on the secretia. And the purple, you can't really see it. There are some small, bright pink flowers in the foliage during the summer. This is also called Moses in the Cradle. And it's the common names you may know better, but when you go to the nurseries, it's the word secretia that's going to tell. If you go and you tell the nursery attendant that you want secretia, they'll know if they have it or not. If you say Moses in a basket, it may not ring a bell with that person. So the Latin names, they're harder to learn, but they definitely are a benefit. You can have bluebells in Texas that don't look anything like bluebells or what people are calling bluebells in Delaware. So as you can see, by the end of July, this garden across my back porch is very full and very beautiful. It's really nice and attractive. These are the references for my presentation today. I gained a lot of experience and information in Master Gardener classes down in Newport News, Virginia, where I resided. And we were also very close to York County and Hampton, Virginia. And I did go to a lot of classes that those Master Gardener associations were giving too. So a lot of my information, we didn't document it as much at that time. And, you know, the sources that I have just are from those associations. So, like I said, you can do extension searches, which will give you information. I know Virginia Tech, you can actually print pamphlets off of the Virginia Tech site, and because they post them on the site. Our own site at Delaware State University, you can look at PowerPoint presentations that have been given for all kinds of information. The two books that I used are The Bountiful Container that Rosemary Nichols McGee and Maggie Stuckey put together. It's an excellent book. It's a paperback. It's not too expensive, and this is what it looks like. The other book that I used is The Lifelong Gardener, Garden with Ease and Joy at Any Age by Toni Gatton. And this is her book that I used, and it has a whole chapter on container gardening, vegetables and flowers. The Bountiful Container that the two women collaborated on is definitely a good guide for those of you who want to plant vegetables in containers. The University of Delaware and Delaware State University have an extension disclaimer. It is the policy of these two institutions that no person shall be subjected to discrimination on the grounds of race, creed, color, sex, age, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, veteran, or handicap status. I want to wish you all, I hope this presentation was informative, and I want to wish you all happy gardening. And now we can open the floor for questions and answers.
Okay, so that was great, Anita. Well done. I'm Kathy Doyle. I'm one of the Master Gardeners, and I'm going to just kind of monitor the chat room here and just going to take the questions in order in which they were written. So the first question, Anita, was how long does a wood container last, and what is the best wood to use that might last the longest?
Right, it definitely depends on your weather. If you're in a very humid climate and that wood is exposed to moisture all the time, it's not going to last very long. And again, I learned my lesson. I have 4 very large raised beds for my vegetable garden, and those raised beds are essentially containers. They were almost 3 feet high. When I built them I didn't build them, when I had them built 7 years ago, I used untreated lumber. And in Delaware's horrible humidity, they lasted until just this year. I had to replace them this year. They were bowed out, they were rotting, they were an absolute mess. So that the indication of how long they're going to last is the kind of weather you're exposed to. If you're in the Northwest, in Washington State, I'm assuming you will not get a container that's going to last, a wooden container that's going to last as long as somebody in Arizona has. And as far as wood, cedar is the best. But again, the expense is there. So you just kind of have to weigh to make your decision how long you want it to last and whether it's worth the expense for your particular container.
Okay, great. What are the pros and cons of grow bags?
I have not had any experience with grow bags. I would say right away, I have seen them. Most of all, they're not going to breathe at all. And again, I don't think they're going to insulate at all, depending upon where you've got them placed. They're not going to insulate and protect the roots from extreme heat or cold. Now, you're not going to use a grow bag in the winter, obviously, but in the summer, they probably heat up, because I've used tarps and things in different situations, and the tarps get very, very hot. And that's what these bags are made out of most of the time. So I guess maybe something like a canvas bag would breathe and also drain better. But I'm not sure. I have not used them myself, and I have not done a lot of research on them. But I would be cautious with them.
Okay. Question about peat moss. Is it still available? This person writes that they heard that it's hard to get.
It is, and so is my perlite and my vermiculite, but I have sought out sources. And if you're willing to travel and go some distance, one thing that I just love as mulch is pine straw. And when I left Virginia, it's used in the South commonly, mainly because they have the loblolly pines that they harvest the dropped needles from. They have orchards of pine, and they harvest the needles every year, and then they sell them in bales. So yes, these things are becoming more harder to find, but I do find them, and when I find it, I purchase it, and that requires a little bit of storage, but then I know that I've got it for the next year. The pine straw, we make trips back to Virginia every year, and we come back with pine straw. And like I said, you can do things like that. The things are harder and harder to find. The bags of potting soil they come more and more pre-prepared. And if you read the labels on the potting soil bags, you'll see that it says, will feed for up to 6 months. That's because they're putting in these fertilizer pellets, the time-released pellets that I'm talking to you about. And they put in the moisture crystals. And it's with the amount that I'm using, it's still less expensive for me to do my own mixing. You might end up, if you're not doing as much as I am, using the good bagged potting soil will do well. And I know you can still buy the fertilizer pellets, and you can buy moisture crystals. So you can fill a pot and use it for a season, and the next season when you want to use it again, you can add those by the spoonful the way I do. So, but yes, the materials are becoming harder and harder to find. They're making it easier for you by doing all this pre-preparation.
I'm glad you said something about the bags of potting soil, because that was a question I actually had. Here's a question. If I use the time-release fertilizer, do I still need the soluble fertilizer once a week?
Yes, I would use it. They kind of complement each other, supplement each other, and especially when the plant is really growing fast in the middle of its, intense growing season, the time release is giving it something, but it might be well able to use the fertilizer in the water too.
Okay. So let's see. Sherry has a hibiscus. It's her first year of having it in a large glazed terracotta pot. She wonders, should I bring it into the garage after frost? Not sure how to preserve the pot and tree.
Right. I am able to leave my terracotta pot, even the unglazed ones, outside, and my fiberglass and my plastic and my glazed pots, there's no problem with. I've had some deteriorate over maybe 5 or 6 years. The Italian terracotta is some of the best. It's fired at a much higher temperature and it's much stronger. It's going to last longer. Eventually, they do deteriorate. The question I would have with the hibiscus is the tolerance of the plant to, I have no idea where this person is located, and I don't know how cold it gets in the winter. The plant itself may not be able to tolerate the cold. Everything that I have in my pots that I leave outside all winter are able to tolerate the cold, and the pots are able to tolerate the cold. So she's going to have to do some evaluating, and I hope she has the label from the hibiscus to see the low range of the temperature tolerance for that hibiscus.
Barry asks, what pH are you looking for with all of the lime when you talked about adding lime?
Well, with that goji berry, my socks were knocked off because I actually found someplace that said it can go as high as 10. But I'm with the cup of it, I think I'm probably a cup of it in that large plastic container. I'm probably about between 7 and 8. And I can tell when the goji berry comes out of dormancy, if I forget it for a week or so, the leaves are just as yellow as can be. And as soon as I add that lime, they turn green. So it's like, oh, finally she remembered. But it's an extremely high. Like I said, I knew I couldn't put that anyplace else because other vegetables, some vegetables, tend towards an alkalinity that's a little higher than 6, the midpoint, maybe 7-ish or whatnot. But that goji berry really wants some alkaline soil.
Okay. Sherry notices you use a lot of pot feet on your beautiful. She wondered if that's to protect the pavers or if it's to help with water draining.
It's both. When I first started container gardening, I was putting pots in saucers on wood deck. Well, after 2 or 3 seasons, and especially down in Virginia, I didn't bring the pots in. After 2 or 3 seasons, I got scolded by the member of the family who has to do the repairs because I was really making a mess out of the wood deck. And I have found since then, even if I have a saucer under the container, the pot feet keep it up off because moisture, when it rains, moisture will get between the saucer and the surface that it's resting on. So putting it up on feet has made a big difference. And that's another thing that I'm finding harder and harder to find. It used to be you saw the pot feet all over the place. And now if I see them, I grab them. The price is going up and they're less and less available. The moisture with a saucer, your pot should only be, when you're watering your pots, and especially when I talked about that gap between the side of the container and the soil, the water is going to run through. You can leave the saucer under the pot for about half an hour. Then you should take the saucer and empty it. You don't want the pot sitting in the soil or in the saucer more than about 30 minutes. The moisture is going to be pulled up in that 30 minutes. That's all you need. And when you are using the feet and a saucer underneath the pot, even if it rains, you can get the saucer, the pot will get wet, the soil will be well watered if it's out in the rain, and then your saucer fills up. You have to do the same thing after a heavy rain. You've got to go out there and get that water, extra water out of the soil because the soil can get too wet. You can drown your roots in wet soil.
Wow. Let's see. So Debbie is just reminding everybody there is a link there for the online evaluation. There are a couple more questions though. And Janine is asking, Anita, if you could put your references back up that screen.
Okay, hold on and let me,
Yep.
okay, there it is.
Okay. Claire is, okay, this is a question about grow bags again, and it might be that you've already given enough about that. But what she wrote is, she says she has great experience with them. She uses them for, oh, I think she's just commenting about it. Hers are great. She uses them for sweet potatoes, has a flap inside to take the potatoes out, and hers has drain holes. So,
Okay, and sweet potatoes especially, they need water. So that's probably an indication that those bags really hold the water. I had sweet potato vine in a metal container, a big old wash tub on a stump one year with, that was my spiller. It was coming over the sides of the elevated tub. And I had some other plants above the sweet potatoes. Well, I'd go out there and this tub was huge. So I knew it was big enough. It was holding water. It was metal. And the plants would be wilted. The sweet potatoes were sucking. I actually had sweet potatoes growing on that vine, which I didn't think of because it was supposed to be an ornamental sweet potato. When I started digging them up, there were sweet potatoes there, and they were taking up all that water. So I'm assuming that if she's using them for things like that, then that's good because they'll hold the water.
ah, good. Adele said that you didn't mention using compost with the potting soil. Do you have an opinion about that?
That's more of an additive too. Sometimes I will, because I make my own compost and I have, cups it's a small composting container. So I'll have just a small amount of it and I'll go around and I will add that at the base of the plants. But I don't usually the peat moss is somewhat of a compost because it decomposes, and the other things that the compost gives, your time release fertilizer and things like that. Like I said, I use a little of it, but not a lot. I use most of my compost around my plants that are in the ground.
And the last question is from Claire, and she's asking what mixture of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus do you use?
This is for I'm assuming she's talking about the fertilizer water, the additive. Is that what she's?
I'm not sure.
Yes, I want to know what you're fertilizing with. Yes.
Okay, that's on the packaging, and it's just a common overall. If your potting soil is good and you've got your time release fertilizer in there, the fertilizer in the water, the additive through the water, is just kind of a supplement. And so it probably should be, or that's what I've been using all these years, is just an overall, not high in any one. And the nitrogen is the most important, especially if you want to go high on anything, go high on the nitrogen, because that's the most unstable chemical in the soil. And when you're in a confined pot and you've got a lot of foliage plants and everything, the nitrogen is what they're going to be using.
Okay. Well, at this point, the only other comments are great job, good information.
Yeah, thank you and happy gardening.